So today's topic is Formula One's budget cap. So we will be discussing if Red Bull really exceeded it and what could be the punishments for the team in the foreseeable future. Formula One's budget cap is a measure from the FIA to stop major teams from spending a lot more money than smaller teams, giving them a competitive edge and making races really boring, where the cars that win are only the ones from rich teams. This has been a topic of discussion for many years following Mercedes' domination in the hybrid era, but it was introduced only fairly recently in 2021 with a budget of $145 million. The FIA is also very specific on what is included in the budget, it being every single move that has an impact on the car and team's performance. For example, the mechanics' salaries are included in the budget since having good mechanics means always having a competitive car, while the hotel those mechanics sleep at is not included since getting a fancy hotel for them will not impact how fast the car is on track. There were also talks about introducing a $30 million salary cap for drivers, a proposal which was not appreciated from F1 drivers themselves, especially Max Verstappen, who in an interview went on to say, "It's the drivers who actually bring the show and put their lives at risk, because we do eventually. So for me, it's completely wrong." Most other drivers have the same opinion, even stating that a salary cap would hurt junior categories. This year, the team budget cap has remained the same, although some teams thought that it should have been raised following recent inflation, which means teams wouldn't have been able to get as much bang for their buck as they did last year. But this seems to be a problem only for certain teams, following an internal document of the FIA stating that while checking if all teams remained under the budget cap last year, they found two irregularities, which was already, following Toto Wolff's words, an open secret in the paddock. The two teams that are speculated to have exceeded the cap last year are Aston Martin and Red Bull, with two different types of infringements. Aston Martin is said to have done only a minor infringement, which means that they went over the cap with only less than 5% of the total budget, while Red Bull is said to have done a major infringement, going over the budget cap plus 5%. This is a really big deal, especially considering how much of a difference it could make for the car's performance. Matteo Binotto, Ferrari's team principal, stated in an Italian interview that Ferrari only spends $4 million a year on development, so it certainly makes a difference, maybe even going as big as half a second per lap. So we all know that Red Bull clearly took advantage of this. The FIA found out these two teams exceeded the budget cap by looking through their financial reports from last year and part of this year. Obviously, since teams are the ones to declare their finances throughout the year to the FIA, they won't always be completely honest, publicly accusing themselves and risking hefty penalties, so they will use some weird strategies. For example, they could tell one of their sponsors to make a test and develop single parts in exchange to having their logo shown on the car for one more race. Or since most teams also make road cars, they could tell their divisions to engineer certain components and give them to the F1 team. As you can see, it's very shady what's really going on behind the scenes. And unfortunately, the FIA doesn't really have a method to keep track of all of the ways an F1 team could be bringing upgrades to their car. So it needs to mostly rely on the honor system, meaning that eventually some teams are going to cheat. And that's exactly what happened. It didn't take all that long. The FIA is currently reviewing the case with the two teams and postponed the verdict to the 10th of October, meaning we will have something to work with right after the Japanese Grand Prix. But let's make some hypotheses. What would be the punishment for the two teams over budget? As we know, Aston Martin is probably less than 5% over budget, meaning that the possible punishments for the team could range from a simple reprimand to a fine to future reductions of the budget cap for the team, and even going as far as giving suspensions from some sessions except the race, or giving a deduction of drivers or team points in the championship. Obviously, all of this wouldn't really mean that much to a team like Aston, which is barely fighting for 9th in the Constructors' Championship as it is. But with Red Bull, it's a whole new story. According to paddock rumours, Red Bull did a major infringement of the budget cap both in 2021 and 2022. For these kinds of infringements, the FIA could give the team test limitations, future reductions of their budget cap, deduction of points from the drivers or the Constructors' Championships, suspension from one or more races, or a complete disqualification from all of the championships. Now, this is the moment when things become a little weird and controversial. Since the infringements were probably done not only this year but also last year, it could mean that giving penalties now could influence last year's Drivers' Championship, won by Verstappen by a really small amount of points, and that's something nobody wants, except Lewis Hamilton. Now, one thing is clear, and that is if Red Bull did really go over the budget cap last year, some sort of punishment must be given, because it's not fair to give one a competitive advantage, especially if they broke the rules they agreed to use. The question remains, what should that penalty be? Giving small penalties like the reduction of constructors' points in the championship, which would likely not even influence the final result of the season, since Red Bull was over 250 clear of Ferrari, or even disqualification from the constructors' championship would not mean that much to the team, since at the end of the day, we know that the cup with the most prestige is the drivers' championships one. Winning that championship is much more important in terms of marketing than winning the constructors. It's like comparing winning the Super Bowl or your local tennis match. Sure, winning a tennis match might be hard, but what are the people most interested in? Since the season finale was so controversial, going back and changing the final results of the season will bring more chaos amongst fans than anything else. But it isn't fair either to let a driver win the championship with an illegal car. It's like if you were playing tennis in your local match, your coach started throwing things at your opponent, and 7 months after the end of the match, your coach was disqualified but you weren't. Okay, I'll stop doing tennis jokes, but what I'm saying is that it would be best for the FIA to make an example of a team that cheats to make sure that nobody will try to do so in the future. But the fact that they kept their punishment so vague and that they are taking so long to decide what to do isn't really what the sport needs now. Giving a harsher sentence to Red Bull would mean having a fan base against themselves, but not doing so would make teams think twice about following the rules. Say they only give the two teams a fine. Well, next year Mercedes would be back on top because they would have an unlimited budget, as they would have enough money to build the best car ever and to pay back the fine, making the budget cap completely useless at bringing the field back together. If only Michael Massey was here, he would just bend the rules a bit, making everyone happy. The reality of it is that it's an exceptionally new problem F1 needs to solve. Never in the past have these kinds of infringements been done. And the only case similar to this would be when back in 2013, Mercedes did an in-season test in partnership with Pirelli in a collaboration approved by F1, which broke the rules that forbid these kinds of tests. And there were rumours going around the paddock that they were going to get disqualified too, but at the end of the day, they just got a reprimand. So what do you think? Should Red Bull's drivers be disqualified from last year's championship? Should the budget cap be higher so that these problems don't occur anymore? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, because at 10,000 subscribers, we're going to create our own F1 team and exceed the budget cap to see what happens. No, not really, but you should subscribe anyways.